Back in the book of Genesis, some terrible thing happens in the area that was later the city of Dothan. Jacob had a group of children. He had a whole lot of sons. And because he had always loved Rachel more than Leah, he had always loved one wife more than another wife, he favored Rachel, who died. He favored her children over the other children. And it had utterly poisoned everything and everybody in that family. There is nothing worse than really, really overt parental favoritism. You know that. And it had poisoned Joseph, who was one of the two children who was a favorite. He had become spoiled. He'd become arrogant, even though he was only a teenager. He was on his way to being an absolutely cruel, awful person. And it had completely destroyed the family system, as we say today, of the place, because the rest of his brothers were bitter and they were cynical, and they had both love-hate relationships with their father, and they were filled with cynicism and anger toward Joseph and Benjamin, and it was a mess. And in the Dothan area, far away from home, when the brothers who were out shepherding saw Joseph come to them in that lonely place, they took him, they threw him in a pit, and they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And there, you might say, Joseph probably turned to the God of his father in the pit, on the trip, in the dungeon he ended up in down in Egypt, and for years and years said, "Get me out of here." Silence. Something happened in Dothan years later. Elisha, the prophet, and his servant were locked up in the city, and it was besieged, and they thought they were going to lose their lives. And they prayed, and of course, the eyes of Elisha's servant was opened, and they saw chariots of fire all around the city. And then God delivered them dramatically the next day. Okay, now that's the way it's supposed to be. Okay, here's one guy in Dothan. He prays and prays, nothing happens. For years and years, decades, God never seems to answer any of the prayer. Another guy prays, chariots of fire. The point is that when we get to the end of the book of Genesis, we see that God was actually as operative in Joseph's life with his grace as he was in Elisha's life. But here's the difference. Elisha needed what? He needed a fairly simple kind of salvation. He needed help from an army. But Joseph and Jacob and all of those guys, they needed something way deeper. They needed their souls saved. And have you ever what if God just showed up to Joseph? Just showed up in a blaze of fire and said, "You are a spoiled brat. Do you realize that if you keep up going the way you are and as self-centered as you are, you're going to destroy your life and nobody's going to like you and you're going to make a mess of your marriage?" Even if God showed up and said, have you ever tried to do that with a teenager? Even if God shows up and says that to a teenager, they won't listen to you. He wouldn't listen to you. Nobody. John Newton, the great hymn writer and pastor, at one point wrote in a letter, John Newton said, "No one ever learned they were a sinner by being told. They have to be shown. They have to be shown." And it took years and years and years for God to break Joseph and his brothers and his father open to grace. It took years and years, and I can't recount that story, but at the very end of the book of Genesis, Joseph turns to his brothers, Genesis 50, verse 20, and says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." We got to the promised land through the desert.